Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. And in today's video, we're going to discuss the Brooklyn Nets, who are in the midst of a very interesting and relatively very good season as well. We're going to look at their trade guide for this year's NBA trade deadline. If you have been keeping up with the channel, you know we're covering all 30 NBA teams with team-specific trade guides focused on who they could look to ship out and potential fits onto their actual roster right now as they look to kind of ramp up for the postseason. And also some teams obviously for the draft, but the Nets more playoff focus right now with the way that things have been going there in Brooklyn, which is a good sight to see, and kind of crazy given where this team was, this past summer with the potential Kevin Durant trade. We've seen a complete flip of what was maybe expected going into this season, which is really awesome. If you guys do enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like on the actual video. Lets me know I'm doing a good job here. Then also subscribe to the channel for more trade guides like this one and other NBA trade deadline coverage. We are going to be live on the channel the week of the NBA trade deadline, so don't miss out on that either. Let's jump into it here now with an actual video preview. We're going to look at the Nets record, their long-term cap space, if that's going to come into play or not. As you guys can guess, that's not likely an outcome here for Brooklyn. That is going to be explored. Draft assets, we'll look at what they have that is tradable, not tradable. Of course, the Nets have made some big moves in recent years, and their overall draft assets have taken a hit in terms of what's tradable, but they still have a couple of pieces that they could move, which is fun to talk about and kind of interesting just looking at where Brooklyn's at. We'll look at some of those tradable players as well, their contract situations. Of course, when it comes to trading, contracts are kind of the most important part. Positive contracts are very valuable. Negative, non-team friendly contracts are usually looked at as a really big negative. And then, of course, the Stepien, or not the Stepien rule, excuse me, the rule about matching money up to 125% when it comes to trades goes a long way in what's feasible for an NBA team. So Brooklyn, their contracts are actually pretty favorable and definitely movable, which I think is a good sign for them. We'll look at some potential trade targets that they could actually look to target. I have 5 specific players that I think would be really good fits into Brooklyn that I think are realistic. One of them I would say is less realistic, but he's kind of an under the radar player anyway. So I don't think it's going to disrupt too much here. If it's not the most likely, I still think he's an intriguing player. I'm not looking at superstars, right, in a trade for Brooklyn right now. I don't think that's what they need. And then the projected activity level. I think that's really a good indicator on what I expect this team to do this NBA trade deadline. When it comes to talking about every single team, not every team's going to make a trade. Not every team's going to go out there and, be like, oh, we got to be big time buyers or big time sellers. Some teams will maybe do something little, but I do think the Nets are a little bit different than some of those teams that maybe won't explore the trade market as much. I think the Nets are in a really prime position to do so. So let's talk about it here by starting with their record. At the time I'm recording this, they are 29-19, which is tied for 4th in the Eastern Conference with the Cleveland Cavaliers. And the one thing I'm going to say about the Eastern Conference right now, you do not want to be 4th or 5th. They are essentially tied for both 4th and 5th right now. They're 2 games back of 3rd, and they're 2.5 games ahead of 6th. I'll also say you don't want to be 6 or lower either. You really want to be a top 3 seed. When you look at how everything's likely going to play out here, for Brooklyn and for the top 5 teams in the East, you've got the Bostons, the Milwaukees, the Phillies of the world. Those are your current 1 through 3, not essentially in that order, but those are your top 3 right now. Then you have Brooklyn and Cleveland. If the playoffs were to start today, Brooklyn would have to play Cleveland. That seems like a bloodbath first round series that maybe goes 7 games and is super challenging and not very fun to have to take part in. Whereas if you're the 1 seed, you're getting a much lighter opponent, same as the 2 seed, the 3 seed. Now, I would watch out for Miami a little bit. They are the 6 seed. I don't think a lot of teams would want to see them in round 1, but I think that 4 or 5 matchup specifically is something to be aware of and something that the Nets probably do want to try and avoid if they can. Now, when it comes to long-term cap space, is that a realistic possibility for them? No, not at all. I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, I would be surprised if Sean Marks has even considered this for a second. Just knowing that his roster possesses both Kevin Durant and Ben Simmons, who are on massive long-term deals right now. It's already hard to see cap space Now, given the fact that Kyrie Irving is headed toward free agency this offseason, there has been some talk about Kyrie Irving wanting to stay in Brooklyn, which is a massive shakeup from where we were even 2-3 months ago. And especially when you look at where we were last June, about 7 months ago, it seemed like Kyrie Irving was heading into his final year with the Brooklyn Nets. And now there's maybe some interest for him to stay, given the right circumstances. And I think Brooklyn, Sean Marks has to think long and hard about that. I think it would be one of the most interesting discussions in NBA history when it comes to a contract, because keeping him around, I don't think you want to sign up for a max contract with Kyrie Irving. I don't think you want to sign up for a fully guaranteed contract with Kyrie Irving. And honestly, it might be one of the few NBA contracts that has a little bit of, pay for play incentives in it, which is something that typically you don't see. So I think those discussions would be a lot of fun, but cap space is not a realistic possibility at all for Brooklyn at this point. Let's look at the draft assets now. What do they have that's tradable? What is untradeable? Well, they do have one 2023 first round pick. It is the highest between the 76ers and the Nets pick, but this pick is not tradable due to some of the other picks that they already owe. For example, they owe Houston their 2024 first. This year, they actually owe Houston a swap option, but with how bad the Rockets are going to keep their own pick. So whichever one of these picks is presumably worse between the 76ers and Nets would go to Utah from the Royce O'Neal trade, which has looked like a pretty solid trade for the Nets, to be honest. O'Neal's played a very solid role for them. Now, of course, it was kind of risky when they traded for him. Just with kind of the volatility of the franchise at that point, it was possible that they were sending out a first-round pick while Kevin Durant did not want to be there anymore. But with how everything's kind of settled, maybe Sean Marks took that gamble saying, if I have to get rid of Kevin Durant, maybe I don't have a job anymore anyway. So let's try and smooth things over with KD by putting together as good of a roster as I can. And O'Neal's definitely helped with that. Now, when you look at some of the tradable first that they have their own 2029 first, which is tradable. Of course, that is way off into the future. We're talking about guys who are, 6th, 7th, 8th graders potentially being in that draft class. And they also do have a tradable 2027 first, which is from the Philadelphia 76ers from the James Harden Ben Simmons swap with a top 8 protection on that pick. Because of that, neither of these picks are super valuable, just with how far out they are. Think about what the Lakers have been supposedly offering, those 2 outdated first rounders that are a long ways away. That's what Brooklyn basically has to offer as well. Now, it doesn't mean it can't get you anything. It probably could in this market get you something. There's not a lot of sellers though, so I'm sure that there's going to be some better offers out on the table. But if you're looking for something specific, it's possible that could maybe go out there and move the needle for a deal. And while you have Kevin Durant playing at a high level, obviously he's been out with an injury, and it has caused the Nets to slide a little bit in the standings. It's been tough, but ultimately at the deadline here, you make a move that you believe puts you over the top in the postseason when Durant is healthy. If Durant's not healthy, this team's not going anywhere. It's just kind of the reality of the NBA with star players. You need your star to be active to have a real shot every single night, especially come playoff time. But you want to do other things around him to give him the best chance to win. And maybe spending these first in the trade market could give them a little bit of an added boost come playoff time. Now let's look at the tradable players. And this is where things get really fun to talk about from Brooklyn's perspective, because typically heading into an NBA trade deadline, most teams are looking at how they can add shooting. How do we add a shooter? How do we add a shooter? And typically a lot of good teams are not willing to give up shooters, because shooters provide a lot of spacing, especially the gravity that they pull out on the perimeter away from a star player is typically so important that you don't want to give those guys up, right? Well, Brooklyn's kind of shied away from 3 really good shooters. Joe Harris playing way less minutes than he typically would as a Brooklyn Net. Seth Curry, his minutes are way down, although he did have an awesome game just the other night recently. And then Patty Mills as well is basically completely fallen out of the rotation. And you look at the contracts of these 3 players. Joe Harris, roughly around $19 million this year, actually a little bit less than that, about 18.7 if I'm not mistaken, then about 19.8 next year. Definitely a swallowable contract, not a terrible contract in terms of value, especially since it will be expiring next season. Seth Curry's on an expiring right now on a very, very good deal, 1 year, $8.5 million. He's already been traded twice on this contract, once from the Dallas Mavericks, once from the Philadelphia 76ers. This is no question asked one of the more movable contracts in the NBA. Seth Curry's a lethal three-point shooter for his career, but I think that one thing that gets overlooked with Seth Curry, yes, he has some defensive limitations, no questions asked about that, but as an offensive player, he's more than just a spot-up guy or a guy who you're going to run off of some flare screens and some pin downs and stuff. He's a player that realistically steps on the floor and he can handle the ball a little bit for you. He makes some right passes. Now, it's not like he's a playmaker, but he's not completely useless in that area like a guy like Reggie Bullock is. He's also able to get off his own shot in the mid-range area to a certain extent. Again, probably not like something you'd want to go to consistently, but you guys have to remember that in playoff basketball, sometimes you just need to find a bucket when the shot clock's winding down and the ball's in the wrong hands. And, Seth Curry comes up and makes some big plays in some of those moments. I've seen it before with Dallas. We saw it a little bit in Philadelphia in his short tenure there. We've seen it even in moments with Brooklyn. So Seth Curry's a good player. There's going to be value around the league for him. And then Patty Mills on the taxpayer mid-level exception is still a valuable contract. I think the one issue here with Brooklyn has always needed size and defense around their stars in Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, James Harden when he was there. The more size that they could have had, the better. And they, found their way to adding these shooters. Of course, the Seth Curry one came up in a very non-orthodox way with the Harden-Simmons swap. Joe Harris has been, a staple in that organization the last half decade plus. And then Patty Mills, I thought was a really nice signing, just given, kind of how he looked in the Olympics right before signing with the Brooklyn Nets. It kind of made sense. But now they're kind of at a point where they want to flip some of the shooting for defense, size, physicality, and length, because that's what they need. And Jacques Vaughn's been very defensive-minded in his approach, the way he's handled rotations and minutes. And because of that, with the talent that their two stars possess, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, two of the best half-court offensive players, both in isolation, dominant offensive players, you don't need the shooters necessarily as much. You need guys who can help you get stops and then, gap fillers. They don't have to be barn burners when it comes to the three-point line. You need guys who are capable catch and shoot guys. You don't necessarily need a whole bunch of movement shooting. Now, I think keeping one of these three would still be smart for Brooklyn. I think trading all three of them does limit what you could potentially do, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that all three could perhaps get moved this trade deadline. And they also do have some cheap rookie deals where, guys who are on that rookie contract still, Cam Thomas, definitely would have some suitors around the league for him. And then Day'Ron Sharpe as well. Those two guys have played a bit this year. Now, their minutes are not at a point where you'd say, oh, those are guys you don't want to give up. I think that they are expendable from Brooklyn's perspective. Now, for me, trading Cam Thomas, it would take a decent amount of value for me to get back. I'm not just attaching Cam Thomas in a deal just to attach him. I really, really like him. I liked his game a lot out of LSU. Day'Ron Sharpe, I'd be a little bit more willing to give up, especially with the play of Nick Claxton this year, who, by the way, I picked as a breakout candidate this past offseason. I said, hey, look, I think Nick Claxton's going to take a big step forward. He has. He's actually third right now in odds when it comes to Defensive Player of the Year. So, and it's well-deserved. He's been a huge factor in Brooklyn's defense, and I think this is why they need to invest in their defense. Put a little bit more length and size and physicality around Durant and Claxton, and it makes it, come playoff time, really hard to play certain guys off the court. We saw it last year when they had Dragic as well with Seth Curry, Patty Mills, and Kyrie Irving. This team was just really, really small, and they struggled against a team like Boston. I think the one positive, Jacques Vaughn had learned from that clearly, and I think the Nets organization is learning from that as well, that if we're going to beat a team like Boston or try and go toe-to-toe with Milwaukee or Miami or Cleveland or even Philly with Embiid, who has all this size, there's a lot of size in the Eastern Conference. You need some physicality. You need some size to match some of that, especially while still having two juggernaut offensive players in KD and Kyrie. So I think that they are going to be aggressive here, at least moving one for sure, maybe two of these guys. And let's get into some of those potential trade targets. One guy that really comes to mind, Jay Crowder, about $9.7 million on his contract for this year. He is an expiring contract, but You think about the type of player that they're looking for, somebody who can knock down catch and shoot threes. He's got a ton of playoff experience, and he brings that defensive effort, the physicality, and the IQ and understanding of, we're not really sure what his athleticism looks like at this point. We're not sure what his conditioning looks like. But the one thing we do know, he's played in a ton of defensive systems. He's a quick learner, and he's somebody who wants to step in and help the team win. There's no question about that. And I think he would really, really help Brooklyn. I think he'd solidify some of those minutes when Durant's off the floor at the 4. And I think that with how versatile both Durant is offensively and defensively, Jay Crowder could fit in next to him as well in the lineup. Durant kind of plays more of that small forward position, which we kind of typically saw from him early in his career back in Seattle and Oklahoma City a bit. He could, easily fit back into that. Now, recent years, we saw him kind of play more of the 4 with Golden State and Brooklyn, because it's made sense. That's kind of the way the league has trended. But Jay Crowder's the type of player that he doesn't really intrude on fit when it comes to the postseason. And I think he would have a really positive impact on this team. As for what a trade could potentially look like, maybe see Seth Curry and a couple second rounders go out in a deal for Jay Crowder. It's also possible we could get a 3-team deal here where Phoenix maybe gets, players X, Y, and Z from the 3rd team. Seth Curry goes to that 3rd team, and then Jay Crowder comes over to Phoenix. Because, it's very possible. Again, like I said, most teams are looking for shooting. Shooting usually does not come in abundance. The Nets have options to give up shooting. That actually does make some sense for them. So there's going to be interest around the league from other teams in some of the players the Brooklyn Nets are looking to offload. And because of that, they have a really good upper hand here in making a deal, say for a guy like Jay Crowder, who I think the Clippers are going to have interest in. I think the Bucks will have interest in. The Mavericks will definitely have interest. The Heat have interest in Jay Crowder. A lot of good teams. I think even the Grizzlies would love to add a Jay Crowder back into the room. Obviously, they had him prior to sending him to Miami. So a lot of teams would love to have Jay Crowder, but I think the Nets are one of the realistic options that could seriously land him at the trade deadline if things go right for them in discussions. Getting into our next player now, this one is a little bit less fathomable for me, but I don't think it's completely out of the realm of possibility. It's John Collins here from the Atlanta Hawks. He's having a real down year compared to where he has historically been. Part of that there in Atlanta is kind of the way that the offense is flowing. Trae Young is very heliocentric with his approach. DeJounte Murray is as well, but he's a little bit different in the way that he does it, but he does, like to count his dribbles as they're playing. So those are 2 players who have the ball a lot. You also have looked at the emergence of AJ Griffin, taking some of those, scoring opportunities. DeAndre Hunter gets a pretty good number of shot attempts a game. Clint Capella, when he's on the floor, still takes up some of that paint space that John Collins would ideally like to work in. So Collins is a guy who is definitely on the outside looking in when it comes to his production and his talent level based on the production. I think he's a more talented player than what he's producing this year. He's on a very spendy contract, which is maybe why Atlanta would consider trading him. So from Brooklyn's perspective, what does it take to get him? That's why I don't think this is super likely. I think a team more likely to trade for John Collins would be the Phoenix Suns. Simply because Phoenix, they have kind of more of a need for a young athlete like John Collins, and they have the draft picks to give it up. Brooklyn, Collins would definitely help them. There's no question about that. He's a player who could fit into that front court. He can knock down a catch and shoot 3 from the perimeter, but he's also highly athletic. Now, I don't think he gives you as much of the defense as we talked about with Jay Crowder. He's shown flashes of that when he's locked in defensively, like when the Atlanta Hawks went to the Eastern Conference Finals. That was probably the best defensive stretch of his career. But that kind of comes and goes with John Collins a little bit, which is what makes him not the perfect fit here for Brooklyn, in my opinion, which is why I don't think that they would ultimately give up one of those, future first-round picks for him, which is why I see this not likely getting done. But I do think his name was worth mentioning in this video. Now, another potential trade target, and this is one I really, really like. Jonathan Isaac from the Orlando Magic. He finally came back to play some NBA basketball. And you might be saying, whoa. You see Jonathan Isaac as a potential fit here with Brooklyn, a team that has a lot of variance. Night in, night out, you're not exactly sure what you're going to get, especially with the personalities. Jonathan Isaac seemingly is a little bit of another guy like that, where he's highly active on Twitter, and I'm not going to knock him for that at all. I don't have any distaste toward Jonathan Isaac in any way, but he's somebody who looks at life bigger than basketball because life is bigger than basketball. But is that what Brooklyn needs? I think that's the big question. And then the obvious question too is he hasn't been healthy. So does somebody who has recently come back from a seriously long absence, does he give you anything come playoff time? And I'm going to say yes to that because he is so lengthy still. And when he's healthy, and I know this is years ago now, but when he was on the court, dude, I'm telling you, he's one of the 5 to 10 best defensive players in the NBA. No question asked about that. He was so incredible early in his career defensively. One of the few players that I would actually say had a really legitimate case at being, the guy who could say, I can guard 1 through 5 in the NBA. I think back to matchups against the Mavericks, a few years ago. He would go from guarding Porzingis one possession to switching on to Luka Doncic and then guarding Jalen Brunson a possession later. That is insane. That you don't see a lot of players really do that, matching up with the 7'3" Porzingis and then switching all the way down into a 6'1" Jalen Brunson. That's what Jonathan Isaac has presented in his time in the NBA. And if you're looking for defenders, Isaac's the guy that I think could really add that serious length. Now, he's not going to help you on the defensive glass a ton. That's one thing that Brooklyn does fall short a little bit. They're not a very good defensive rebounding team. Isaac at least has length and size. He's not a phenomenal defensive rebounder, though. He's an okay fit here. The one thing I really like about it, though, you probably see like a Joe Harris and maybe a second-round pick or 2 type of trade where Orlando says, yeah, we kind of like Paolo and Franz as our long-term forwards anyway. We don't really know what the future is for Jonathan Isaac with our franchise. And we could kind of get off some of that money now, bring in a veteran who probably is a good fit onto their roster. I think Orlando needs more shooting anyway. Joe Harris could provide that for them. Not that it means they're going to win this year, but it kind of gives them a taste of seeing what a good shooter would look like next to some of those young guys, which I do think there's a lot of positives to experimenting with stuff as you have young players and seeing what works and what doesn't before they get onto big contracts. Because then kind of what roles you're looking to fill around them as you go about building that roster up. And from Brooklyn's perspective, again, it's another guy who's 6'10", 6'11" with crazy wingspan and really good defensive anticipation. And there's not a lot of young players in the league. Yes, Isaac's missed a lot of time, but he's still relatively young. And you think about, trading for a guy who's in his mid-20s. It's usually not if he's an impactful player for a second-round pick or 2. That's what kind of the opportunity I think that Brooklyn would maybe have here with Isaac. And I think one that you have to look at it long-term. You're building for the next 2, 3, 4 years with Kevin Durant under contract. Jonathan Isaac fits the timeline there, even if it takes a little bit of time this year to get him up to speed. Our next one now, and this is one I really like, Gary Trent Jr. from the Toronto Raptors. I would be pretty surprised if he doesn't get traded this year. I think him and Fred VanVleet are 2 of the most likely trade candidates in the NBA. And Gary Trent Jr. is the one that's a real fit here for Toronto. He's about 6'5". He's got the prototypical size you're looking for an off-ball guard in the NBA. He's got that 6'5" frame, really good length, and he's very disruptive. He's a good on-ball defender, not necessarily in the, I'm going to sit down in a stance and stay in front of a guy for an entire 24 seconds and, force him into a bad shot. He's the type of on-ball defender that's, going to be pesky. He's going to poke at the ball, get a few on-ball steals, and make a guy be really careful while dribbling the rock around him. But then he also does a good job jumping passing lanes, being disruptive in that way defensively. And I think that gives them something they currently don't have. Brooklyn right now, their defensive system is kind of built around length and rim protection. That's why Nick Claxton's been so important for them this year. That's why Kevin Durant's been such an impactful defender for them as well, kind of as a weak side help guy. And, guys like Yuta Watanabe being very smart, defensive players in terms of team defense, stepping in, being willing to take a charge or at least force an extra kick out. There's been definite improvement with the way Jacques Vaughn's coached this team up. But I think Gary Trent Jr., that type of defensive anticipation, getting in the passing lane, disrupting stuff would be really beneficial for them. And the nice thing is he's not even a bad offensive player, right? You're getting somebody who could probably be on certain nights your 3rd best offensive player and help you win a playoff game. I think Gary Trent Jr. has that level of skill set. Now, can you rely on that consistently? No, I don't think so. But when you have Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, I think you have a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to how productive and how consistent your third best offensive guy is, especially when there's nights that, hey, maybe Nick Claxton gives you an efficient 15 to 20, which he's been doing a ton of recently. There's a lot of positives for Gary Trent Jr. fitting onto this roster. I think he's very physical. Now, does it help their defensive rebounding? No, he's a guard. He's not going to be a great defensive rebounder for them. I think he's a solid positional defensive rebounder, but Gary Trent Jr. is somebody who I still think does make some sense in terms of the contract. You're looking at probably Joe Harris, and then that's where you have to maybe consider throwing in one of those future firsts. Otherwise, for the Raptors perspective, why would they be willing to do this? Again, Gary Trent Jr. likely will not be back with them next season, just given his contract status. We saw them do the same thing with Norm Powell when they traded Norm Powell away for Gary Trent Jr. They have been somewhat hesitant to lose guys for nothing in free agency to a certain extent. Now, of course, they made the big move with Kawhi Leonard. That panned out very well for them. And then they did lose him in free agency ultimately for nothing, but they have a championship to show for that. Gary Trent Jr., obviously not a Kawhi Leonard level player, and I think moving on from him would be smart. And with how poorly the Raptors have shot from three this year, in addition of a serious three-point shooter like a Joe Harris, would be, I think, honestly really beneficial for their offense, giving some spacing around, Pascal Siakam and Scotty Barnes of the world. I think that would be very beneficial for Nick Nurse and something that they just haven't had in their offense the last couple of years. My final potential trade target here for the Brooklyn Nets is Naji Marshall of the New Orleans Pelicans. This is the one that I would deem least likely, partially because he's on a very cheap contract. The Pelicans don't have a lot of reasons to trade him away, other than the, kind of looking in the mirror and saying, wow, we have a lot of really good wings, right? Come playoff time, how much does Naji Marshall play? And I know Naji Marshall is having an awesome season for them. I'm one of the biggest fans of Naji Marshall. I think he's extremely underrated. I think probably a lot of people in the mainstream media, working for ESPN might not even know who Naji Marshall is, to be honest with you. We know Shaquille O'Neal does not know who Naji Marshall is, but Naji Marshall is good. And I think he'd be such a great fit in Brooklyn, but it's hard for me to see New Orleans be willing to give him up. The one way I would maybe think about this working out is if New Orleans were to get a couple second-round picks and a shooter, probably say like Seth Curry, I think there's at least some consideration, because New Orleans looks at themselves and says, okay, we have Brandon Ingram, we have Zion Williamson, we have Herb Jones, we have Trey Murphy. We also have Dyson Daniels, who kind of plays like a wing. Do we need Naji Marshall long-term? Do we need him this postseason? The answer to that for them might be yes, and I think that's justified. But it also could be no. And I think a movement shooter like a Seth Curry could make some sense. Now, it's very tricky here because you're going to have to work out the contracts, which is why I don't see this one very likely, just because Naji Marshall makes such little money that it's hard to match a good contract with him from a good player. There's just not a lot of good players on deals similar to Naji Marshall. So it makes it hard to really rationalize how a trade would go down. You'd probably need a third or maybe even fourth team involved, kind of helping move some money around with a guy around $4 to $5 million. And then, it gets tricky that way, where New Orleans would have to give up a little bit more and, pieces move around, that kind of stuff. But I'm not ruling it out. I think Naji Marshall's like a very underrated player. I want Pelicans fans who are watching this to not think I'm sleeping on Naji Marshall. I know he's a very solid player in this league, and I know he's a really good team defender. He likes to take on the individual challenge guarding a guy. On his offensive game has really, really taken some steps forward in the last year and a half or two. I think Marshall's a good player. That's why I think the Nets would be doing really well to trade for him. But I don't think it's the most likely thing either. I think out of all of the five players here, Naji Marshall is probably the least likely to be acquired. So when it comes to projected activity level, I think that the Nets will be undoubtedly active. I think they're for sure going to look to make a trade or two. I would be surprised if they don't, just given, kind of the volatility we've seen around this franchise in the past. When things are going well, they want to ride some of those highs and add to it and build and hope that at some point, maybe if stuff goes right for you in the postseason, maybe if you stay healthy and a team doesn't that you're facing, maybe they can win a title at some point. Now, I don't think it's this year. I would be kind of shocked if it is, But with how good Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are at times, I don't think a lot of teams would want to play them in a 7-game series either. You think about how unlucky this franchise got with the Kyrie Irving injury landing on Giannis Antetokounmpo's foot. Then you also look at James Harden pulling his hamstring in that series. The Nets were going to be bona fide champions if those injuries did not occur the way that they did. And now instead they find themselves in a completely different era of Nets basketball, no longer with James Harden, and a completely different team, different coach than what they were expecting to try and win with. But they find themselves in a very strong spot still, and they're a team that can definitely do some damage this postseason. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you did enjoy this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more as well. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. What will the Brooklyn Nets look to do this trade deadline? Make sure to come stop in for the live streams during NBA trade deadline week. Turn on the notification bell, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.